Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be making these trousers from the Lutterloh 320 supplement number 61 and demonstrating to you how to install a fly zipper and a double welt pocket. Hope you find this video useful, so let's get started. Start by positioning the pattern piece you're about to draft on your paper. I always secure mine with a coaster between the paper and the pattern to ensure my drawing pin stays secure. Next, find your hip measurement and put your drawing pin in the hole next to it. Place the pin and the golden rule into the X that is marked on the pattern piece. Line up the side of the golden rule with the line beneath each measurement. Measure out to the measurement and place a dot. When all the dots have been marked, lift the miniature pattern from the paper. Using a combination of the curved and straight rulers, join the dots to your pattern. Repeat this for all pattern pieces. You can see on this pocket pattern that the X is on the outside of the pattern. Follow the same process as before to draft this pattern piece. There are a couple of pattern pieces that are just rectangles which can be measured out. When you see the symbol CA, that means it's an approximate measurement. Mark the darts, the pockets and facings on your pattern. Next, cut out all your pattern pieces. I'm going to do mine with seam allowance, but it's entirely left with you if you choose to leave the seam allowance off and cut your fabric with the seam allowance included there. Using your pattern pieces, trace any facings and make separate pattern pieces for them. These will be useful when cutting out interfacing. Make sure that you true your pattern. That means placing the pattern pieces that are going to be sewn together on top of each other to make sure that they are the same length or follow the same curve. One thing I've noticed with the Lutterloh patterns that they don't distinguish between a facing and an interfacing, so the chevrons that you see marked on the pattern can be a little bit confusing, I feel. They sometimes need to be cut as a facing and other times they actually need to be cut as an interfacing, so just be aware of that. So here's my fabric. It's a stretched jacquard. I've used the repeating pattern to get my straight grain and then folded it in half. Next, cut out your pattern pieces. It takes a few tries to get the layout with the least waste, but it's worth taking the time. Luckily, this pattern can be placed in both directions. Secure the pattern pieces and cut. If you haven't already added seam allowance, be sure to add this now. Next, find the pattern pieces that need facings and interfacings and cut them out. And make sure all fabric has markings transferred for pockets and zips. Next, fuse interfacing. I'm going to start work on the centre back seam and the darts. On some of these seams I'm planning on overlocking them, taking away the seam allowance, but on the areas around the zip and the side pockets I'm going to be stitching them and keeping the seam allowance. It's just a bit easier around the fiddly areas to have a bit of seam allowance to work with. Next I'm going to plot the place for the welt pockets. On the Lutterloh pattern, the pocket sits just on the tip of the dart. There isn't a measurement to follow, so I'm going to eyeball what looks right for me, then measure one pocket and transfer the information onto the other pocket. I'm also going to mark the pocket positions on the rear of my fabric. And a quick way of transferring the information onto the other side is to use pins going through all layers, and then you can mark it with your tailor's chalk. Next, I need to put the pocket markings on the Welt patch pockets. On the part that's been interfaced, I'm going to find the centre of the interface piece, top and bottom and side to side, then measure out from the centre the size of my pocket. It's actually 13 centimetres wide. Now that I've marked the pocket on both pieces, I just need to line up the two pieces. I'm going to use the pin again to line up my points. The pin's going to go through both points, and then I can pin both pieces together. The next thing is to consider how big I want the Welt pocket opening to be. You can have a really thin opening with either one welt or two welts showing, but to me, Lutterloh have given a specific amount of fabric to make the welt, so I'm going to have a welt opening of just under 2 centimetres. So I'm going to sew a rectangle box around my markings. It's about 2 centimetres high by 13 centimetres wide. When the boxes are sewn, I need to cut through all layers of the fabric. I start with a slit in the centre of the box, then carefully cut into the corners, making sure not to cut any of the stitches that I've just sewn. The closer you can get to the corners, the flatter your opening will sit, and clip away at any bulky seams too. Push the welt patch through to the wrong side of the trouser and press it flat to create the flaps that show in the welt opening. And you do this by bringing the fabric from the welt patch 1 centimetre from the top and 1 centimetre from the bottom, and placing that over the opening that you've just created. I'm just going to pin it at the sides for now and check what it looks like from the right side. So mine does look a bit lumpy at the moment, but when the seam allowance has been cut away and pressed, it will sit a lot better. If you prefer a single welt, all you have to do is make the flap at the top flush with the welt opening, and then the flap at the bottom needs to be deeper. When you're happy with how you want your welt pocket to look, you can either top stitch in the seam of the welt, or you can top stitch on the outside of the box. And here are my pockets top stitched. To finish off the welts and make them into pockets, all you have to do is lift up the bottom section of the welt patch, line it up with the top of the welt, and overlock around the 3 raw edges. Next to do on the back, I'm going to move on to the side seam pockets. I'm going to match up the marks that I found on the side seams and the patch pockets. Pin that in place and then overlock it. I'm going to move on to the front of the trousers and install the fly zipper. So the difference when installing this type of zipper is each front pattern piece is sewn slightly differently. Female trousers usually close right side over left, male openings usually close the other way around. Before you start work on the centre front, you may want to overlock this raw edge because you won't get a chance later on when it's all sewn together. So I have my left hand trouser piece here, that's going to sit on my left leg. So this sticking out piece here on the pattern, which I've interfaced, I'm going to fold in half so it covers the interfacing that I've fused to it. Then I'm going to get a standard zip, not an invisible zip, and pin the right hand side of that zip to the fold that I've just created. Line up the top of the zip with the top of the fabric so you have enough zip to sew into the waistband when you get to that point. Pin as close as you can to the teeth of the zip, baste this down if you need to, and then stitch in place. Next I move on to stitching the crotch seam. With both trouser fronts together, right sides together, stitch 1.5 centimetres or whatever your seam allowance is away from the raw edge, and stitch a slight bit higher than the base of the zip. So now that the crotch seam has been stitched, you can see how it's all going to fit together. The extended flap on the right hand side of the trousers simply folds back to become the panel that covers the zip. And the final part of stitching in the zip is to stitch the second hand. I find it easier to pin from the rear side and then flip the fabric back over and pin from the front. Check that it's all nice and flat, and then you can either pin and baste in place. A little tip to make your top stitching really straight. I use some masking tape to mark out the top stitching line of the zip. Make sure your masking tape isn't going to ruin your fabric or leave any residue on it. Use that as a guide to stitch your fly zipper in. Just place the masking inside of where you're going to be top stitching so that you don't stitch onto it, and then it makes it really easy when you need to remove it. It also helps me to avoid stitching over the metal clamp that's at the bottom of the zip. So that's the zip stitched in. Next, to add the pockets to the side seams. Same as the rear pockets, just matching up the notches and sewing them in place. Then I can sew from the outer edge of the pockets all the way around the pocket and down the side seam to the ankle, all in one go. Next, I stitch the inside leg seam, starting from one ankle, lining up my crotch and sewing to the other ankle. Just have a quick try on, and you can see a bit more of that if you watch my review video. If you have seen that video, you'll know that I took the pockets out at this point, but if you did want to keep the side seam pockets, simply stitch the pocket to the front panels and that will be ready for installing the waistband. So here's my waistband piece, and I'm going to overlock just one side of it. No need to do the other side as they will all be stitched away. Leave a 1.5 centimetre overhang at both edges of the trouser and pin the waistband in place. One thing I like to check before I finish off the waistband is whether it has been stitched at the right height. The waistband should sit in line. If it's not, then it's quite easy to rectify. Just stitch the line which is sitting a little bit high, and that should get them back in line. Just try to avoid the metal clasp if you're making any adjustments. Next, I need to make a waistband. So folding right sides together and overhang the waistband slightly so you have a little bit of fabric to stitch onto, then box in the corners of the waistband. Make sure that the seam allowance is pointing upwards because this will be tucked into the waistband and you won't see that. Do this on both edges. When they've been stitched, you can cut away the excess. I'm just going to taper into the point so they're not as bulky. Push it through to the right sides and you should have enough fabric to stitch down the waistband in the crease and catch the stitches above the overlocking. You can actually feel it with your fingers as you're stitching in the groove, so it turns out really neatly. I'm going to use a hook and eye for my fastener because that doesn't show on the right side. And lastly, I need to hem them. So I just need to overlock the raw edge and then straight stitch a 3 centimetre hem. And that's it. I hope you found the sew along helpful. As always, please ask me any questions. I will endeavour to make a step-by-step download tutorial for this video. So keep checking the website mystylishsoul.co.uk and also connect with me on Instagram, which is at mystylishsoul, and I'd love to follow your accounts and see what you're making at the moment. Until next time, thanks so much for watching and I shall see you again.